Boom! I'm in the room. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Everyday Conversations regarding mental health. Because there's nothing on the telly, that's probably why you're here. So I'm coming to you live from the old Hill Manor, and I'm your host, Lord Hill. Tonight, we're going to be having a chat about... just a quick reminder. The live stream awesome quiz every Tuesday. Don't forget to tune in. If you miss them, if you miss the live, you can always go back and do them after. So they're all up there ready to have a go at. Test your skills. There's only 30 questions. And they should all be easy. Actually, we had the coronation special quiz on Tuesday, and lots of people were scoring fairly high. So there you go. Give yourself a chance. So obviously, everyday conversation regarding mental health is all about taking out the stigma around the mental health, mental well-being. Tonight, we're going to have a chat about, we're going to continue the chat about suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, and some other veterans issues with a veteran, no doubt. So, I've got a special guest on tonight. This guy joined the US Army, and he was his regiment was the 1st Airborne, 101st Airborne, and they are famous for dropping into Holland on Operation Market Garden. So, without too much further ado, I'll bring in my guest. So, John. Welcome to the Hill Manor.
Thanks, Tim. I wish I had confetti and applause every time I enter a room.
I only do it for special people.
Yeah, I bet.
So, John, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, about a little bit about your career and how you got into the army, and what drove you to join it in the first place. Especially going into an airborne where you have to get out of aeroplanes at heights rather than wait for them to land. Be interesting. And then we'll come back and have a chat. So it's over to you, John. Tell us all about yourself.
Veteran kind of has 3 lives. You have your pre-military life, your military life, and your post-military life. And I actually feel like I've done kind of more for veterans and the country after the military than even when I was in the military. So I'm a combat veteran of Afghanistan. I have a master's degree from Harvard in international education, because originally my experiences in Afghanistan trying to open up schools for girls really, opened my eyes, I think, to the brutality of a lot of the world. And I wanted to work in like refugee camps. So after going to school for that, I taught in Thailand and Cambodia. And while I was going to school, I wrote a book for student veterans, which is what I work in now. So I've spoken to Congress about legislative issues concerning student veterans. My book is Combat to College, and it's a guide to help student veterans get through their education and make the most of their lives post-service. I've worked, for a long time in the veteran community. Now I live in the Dominican Republic, where I'm going to school for my doctorate and online, and continuing writing and helping veterans through various coaching programs.
Terrific.
30 seconds, a minute story.
So, what possessed you to join the airborne forces in the first place?
I think that, everyone kind of joins the military for different reasons. I wanted adventure. That was kind of my thing. I grew up in a small Iowa town, and escaping there seemed appealing at the time. And I think that people who join the military are people that crave adventure and kind of going on to the unknown and things like that. I was actually trying to pursue a career in mixed martial arts, doing fighting, before I joined the military. And after getting beat up a few times, I decided maybe that's not the best life for me. And I went ahead and found the recruiter's office. But I did pursue community college beforehand, and I failed out of community college. And it was interesting because now people like, I failed out of community college, but now I have a master's degree from Harvard. So I always tell people the good things the military can do for you. They instilled in me this discipline and this drive that I definitely did not have before joining.
Uh-huh. So what were you doing in community college other than getting sort of knocked about in Jap slap?
Well, I was much more interested in drinking and girls than going to class, which is, I think why I failed out. But, but then, the military straightened you out, and I think the military can do that for a lot more people. Here in the States, we're facing an enormous recruiting crisis where people aren't very keen to join the military now. And over 80% of the military comes from military families, and a lot of the veterans now are telling their kids, hey, maybe don't join, maybe try something else. So that's kind of an alarming current trend going on here in the States.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the States that's the problem with recruiting. We've got the same problem over here. And I think what it is because we're not in a sort of major conflict of any sort, that has a detrimental effect on recruiting. All the time we're in places like Kosovo, Northern Ireland, the Balkans and Bosnia and stuff like that. Then later on to Afghanistan and Iraq, recruiting was quite good because guys want a boy's own adventure, basically. So recruiting's normally pretty good. But it's a double-edged sword because these guys they sign up, they do 4 years, they get trained up, they go on an operational tour, get a medal, come home, and then leave again. Particularly if when they've been on a proper operation, they've been in the thick of it, they come back and they find going out on a normal type of exercise using blanks and stuff like that just doesn't cut it for them. And fair enough, that's one of the big reasons why guys only do a few years.
Yeah, and a lot of the headlines you're seeing out of the military are obviously bad news. I know thinking about veteran suicide, some of the mental health statistics surrounding military members. I think that's why we need to highlight veterans who are doing well because the bad stuff makes the news. But there are certainly great things about the military. It's cool for me to talk to a guy who served 44 years, which is longer than I've been alive at this point. So
I did have a lot of fun. I did take an awful lot of liberties as well, I must admit. Put my hand up to taking one or two liberties. But I enjoyed it. I found it a lot of fun. I had some real golden opportunities, particularly in the latter years once I climbed the old greasy pole. Once I got up into the sergeant's mess, it just opens up a lot more doors. And I was fortunate. I managed to go across to psychological operations, which was a fantastic game. I did 7 operational tours in the discipline, which was brilliant. I did a year in Kosovo from 99 through 2000, and I learnt the craft. I learnt the craft of psychological operations, which was brilliant. The following year, in 2001, I was in Macedonia, and I was in Macedonia when 9/11 happened. 5 months later, I'm flying into Kabul in 2002, and that time Kabul was brilliant. I loved it. It was great. I had lots of opportunities to interact with the locals. I managed to do interviews with Ashraf Ghani, Hamid Karzai, the Minister of the Hajj, and a few other ministers for the newspaper that we were developing at the time, which was great. And
I'm sure they had kind of an optimistic outlook at that point, especially for British and Americans
absolutely
over. Obviously, that shifted pretty quickly.
Yeah, just going to say hello to
And
the guys. Yeah, hi Keith, hi Chris. First time, Chris. Don't forget to smash the like button, and and while you're at it, subscribe to the channel. So
yeah, it's so easy for us to zero in. to zero in on those negative experiences the military gives us. And I definitely did that when I first got out. I mean, I struggled with drinking, with pills, because I went to the VA when I was dealing with my PTSD, and
Yeah.
they prescribed me for pills for everything under the sun. It was like a vending machine. I'm like, pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to not be depressed, to not be anxious. And I really, was just thinking about the past. I was so focused on my negative military experiences, seeing the kind of bloodshed, horror, things that veterans,
Yeah.
combat veterans have to see, that I was just viewing my experiences in a negative light. And it took a while for me to look at those experiences as opportunities for growth, and not just, things that had screwed my life up.
Yeah, I found one thing that they never ever tell you is when you're going through your training and all the rest of it, you don't you see it on the movies and all the rest of it, things getting blown up and one thing and another, getting people getting shot. What they don't tell you is the smell that's related to it. And I don't know what you've related or what sets your trauma off, but occasionally you get an occasional smell of death, and that sort of triggers something a bit, gives us a little bit of a gentle wobble occasionally. And I think one of the things that the British military have been pretty good at in the last few years is something called trim. When we're on operations, guys that are involved in a conflict and some sort of nasty incident, a trim team will come in, which is trauma incident management, and they'll go in sort of 72 hours after the incident. They'll identify who's at risk and who needs what sort of briefing, whether it's an individual needs individual chat, whether it's a group chat, or whether it's an overall briefing. And then they'll give them a score, and then they'll go back in 30 days later, and they revisit everybody. And if they then starting at any time during that period still having problems sleeping and all the rest of it, then they'll refer them on to a specialist, and then they'll go back in again at the 3 month period and look at everybody again, just to see if everybody's come through it and okay. The problem comes when you've got guys that are in the forward operating bases that are out having multiple contacts day after day. Those are the guys that are slightly more difficult to help. But what they do at the end of the tour is they do decompression. Everybody hates it because all they want to do is when they come out of the conflict area, they just want to get home.
Yeah.
But that's a negative. The negative of that is you don't get a chance to vent off, and I think that causes more problems where people miss decompression. It's only a few days
Yeah.
down the beach, having a few beers, talking over your experiences and stuff like that, and that goes a long way to nullifying a lot of the PTSD problems that guys suffer later on. And for me personally, it wasn't until I left the military and I'd been out a couple of years that I had a bit of a wobble. I was because I've done all the courses, I recognised what was going on, and I sought help for it. But I used to get emotional over silly things, absolute silly things. I could be watching a cartoon and I'd be there sat in tears. So I sought help, and unfortunately, I saw civvies, the civvy practitioners, and although they were really good, they just didn't understand what I'd been through. And it wasn't until I had a chat with a couple of mates that I was able to square myself away. And touch wood, I'm okay. But
Yeah, that target
for lots
approach
of
is
people,
good, but like you said,
yeah, lots of people
if you have that, that's
that doesn't happen. So
Yeah, I think that kind of targeted approach is, when something happens, to hey, kind of zero in on that. But obviously, if you're in a situation where it's like, hey, everybody's facing trauma. I mean, we're off. We got
Yeah,
50 guys on this base, and we're all going through combat every day. So I think that's great that the military is starting to do that. When I came back, we went through it from, in America, kind of a similar experience where you go in and everybody just wants to get the hell out of there so they can go have a beer or see their girlfriend
yeah,
or wife. They are not thinking, hey, I want to sit down with a shrink right now. I was just overseas for 15 months. Like, the last thing I want to do is talk about anything. And they ask you the worst types of questions. You go
yeah.
in there and they say, did you ever think about, harming anyone? You're like, yeah, I thought about harming lots of people. The people are
That was
shooting at
my
me.
job.
And they think, yeah, that's what. I mean, they just, it's kind of just cookie cutter approach to therapy, which is one of the problems. Is that's all kind of the big government can do, is kind of just this cookie cutter approach. Whereas therapy really has to be individualized for the person, and that takes time. It also takes kind of a self to figure it
Yeah,
out. Where you can't put your trust in the VA. I remember one day complaining to my friend, like, "Hey, I'm not getting help. Like, they're prescribing me pills, doing this, doing that," and I was kind of venting. And he was like, "Well, what the hell are you doing to help yourself?" And that's something I never really thought about like that, because responsibility in the military is shared. You're shared within the unit, within the group. You have leadership.
yeah.
It's really shared everything environment. And then when veterans, you have to embrace that individual responsibility in order to find any semblance of growth.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well, that I think that the first thing that they do when you go and see the doctor, they offer you pills, they offer you
Hmm.
antidepressants, and that's the last thing that you need. I think
Right.
the first thing you need is to sit down and have a chat with somebody about it. And
Yeah.
I think,
And the things
and it,
you're,
yeah, and it should be peer led, and I think that's really important.
absolutely.
Somebody that understands what you've been through, rather than a civilian that hasn't been through that sort of conflict.
Yeah, and veterans are kind of, you're in need of things that can't be prescribed. I think that we're looking for the meaning of life and looking for things kind of in the wrong places. You used to
Yeah,
go to like rabbis or pastors or whoever about your problems, and now we turn to the medical field. But the answers aren't necessarily there. Veterans are in need of a new life mission. They're in need of pursuing their own forms of therapy. They're in need of new challenges. They're in need of finding their element after the military, because nothing's really as all encompassing as the military is. And that's where I think a lot of veteran issues are actually more wrapped up into transition stress than PTSD. Because the United States, it's actually non combat veterans that kill themselves more. And that's because these people often never feel at home again in society when they get out. They feel more comfortable, in combat boots than they ever did again in business shoes. So dealing with that transition is actually the most important thing you can do when you get out, is how to execute that. And that's one of the things I do in my coaching practice, is I help veterans get through that transition in a way that is individualized.
that's an interesting statistic actually. I hadn't. We don't look at it in detail, and we've only just started looking at veteran suicide in the last couple of years, where coroners are
Hmm.
actually recording whether it's been a veteran that's taken their own life. But it's interesting you say that it's the non-combatant types that have the problems. And
Hmm.
I'm not quite sure what it's like for the Americans, but certainly for the vast majority of British service personnel that went to, particularly Afghanistan, the vast majority were based at Bastion, which is a massive, massive, sprawling area. The vast majority never got off base. They flew into Bastion. They spent their 6 months there doing either in the hospital or in the logistics and all that sort of thing, and then they flew out again without it going outside the wire. Now, a lot of and then you got the infantry types that were in patrol bases, forward operating bases. Those guys were seeing the action, but it's a small number compared with the vast number that actually went to Afghanistan. I'm just wondering whether it's the guys that were in non-combatant roles that didn't leave Bastion are the ones that are having the problems. Be interested
Yeah,
to
and that's
see the
something that
statistics on it. Yeah,
so that's something that I thought about, especially as I had my friends take their lives, guys I served with, made me think about, what are preventive factors that we could put around this to prevent this. And who kill themselves in the American military are actually people who do one term and then get out. And people, so the longer you stay in the military, the less chances you have of killing yourself. So guys that do 20 years are less likely to kill themselves than guys that do 4 years. Also, people who have college degrees kill themselves less. So people with college degrees, that's why I focus in on education in a lot of my work, because your financial health obviously plays a lot into your mental health. And people with college degrees make more money than those without it. People with college degrees are less likely to be on drugs. People less likely to be homeless, less likely to have, get divorced, and more likely to make more money, and less likely to kill themselves. So that's why one of my things is I encourage veterans, hey, go to school. College is for you. Learning is for you, because it's so easy to look at our lives and be like, especially here in America, you kind of have three options after you graduate high school: the workforce, the military, or college. And a lot of us choose the military, maybe because college wasn't for us at the time, or we had no interest in higher education. So it's hard to come back and go to a classroom again. I started college again when I was 30, which was, difficult to sit there in a classroom with a bunch of 18-year-olds who just I could not relate to whatsoever.
I don't know how you managed it. I couldn't.
Yeah, I was sitting
It's
there
not
at the
for
back of
me.
the room. I couldn't even talk. I couldn't even talk without cursing at the time. I remember one time the professor asked me to stay after. I was in infantry for 10 years. And then he's like, "Hey, John, I appreciate your feedback, but you have to watch your language." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "You said the F word like 3 times today." I was like, "Oh man, I'm sorry." Just
I'll tell you a
because,
little
we have
story
this kind
about
of
that.
different way of communicating.
I'll tell you a little story about that. We we had some exchange guys come over from America from the 4POG, I think it was, Psychological Operations Group from Fort Bragg. On an exercise, we did a big NATO exercise in Germany, and these guys came out with us, and they had a staff sergeant with them, and he couldn't open his mouth without using the F word. Every sentence was F this, F that, F, 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 F. He just didn't have any other language. And it was bizarre, absolutely bizarre. Um,
Yeah, and that's why
yeah,
that transition is what gets people, because we're not only, we speak a different language, we, refer to time with the military clock. I mean, there's all these different acronyms, and that's why communications between civilians and military people can be kind of problematic, because we're just coming from different worlds. And veterans,
yeah,
when they get out of the military, then they go try and work an office job. And the type of stuff is perfectly acceptable to say in the military is just a no-go
yeah,
in today's corporate world, where you have to be more careful with your language. So a lot of
absolutely.
veterans can get in trouble because we're more likely to deal with conflict head on, to where civilians are less likely to do that.
Yeah. So, for anybody who's out there watching, if you've got any questions for either of us, please pop them in the chat. We're happy to answer anything, almost anything, anyway. So,
Yeah,
one of the
nothing too
slogans
complicated.
that yeah, one of the slogans that people have been pushing around over here is "It's okay not to be okay." And our, some of our royal family, Prince William and Princess Kate, have been pushing "It's okay not to be okay." Young Harry was also doing the same, but I think he's gone off the subject slightly. We all know what's happened to him. He's he's under that, and he.
Yeah, yeah, that's a complicated part of your country at the moment, seems to be.
Yeah. One thing we certainly don't want is to be a republic. We could see what America's got, and we don't want anything like it. Where we've had a constitutional monarchy for over 1,000 years, and it's worked fine. Why do we need to change it?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what. After years in the military and traveling around, I feel more at home here in the Dominican Republic a lot of times than I do in my own country, because it's just an easier, laid back way of life. And one thing that I'm currently doing is, encouraging veterans to pursue opportunities outside the United States, because you can survive and live well on a military retirement here in Dominican Republic or other places where you can't live, in America. I mean, I left Boston, and my rent was, when I was living there, and my rent was $2,500 a month, and my rent here is $500 a month. So it's one of those things where it's like, as a veteran, you can truly retire a little bit more, and I can focus on myself and my growth and my healing, because I did go through times in my life where I was, bad PTSD, depression, things like that. And escaping the political division and the anxiety and all the stuff in the United States has really been helpful for me.
So what language do they speak there? Spanish, is it? Dominican Republic?
Spanish, yep.
So
Yep.
you must be fairly fluent in Spanish, or do you, do you like the Brits?
I'm about halfway there. I'm about halfway there. So it's something I work on, and that's something that it's good, because it's an opportunity to continue learning and things like that. But I can definitely order beer, which is the main thing that I need to be able to
Of
do.
course.
So it's
Yeah.
yeah. So
Dos cerveza, s'il vous plaît. Por favor.
that's pretty much it. So they so now I'm really enjoying life, and gotten to really help veterans through my writing and my blog, where I'm able to do articles about nature therapy and things like that, and travel therapy for veterans, because we tend to look at therapy as this kind of like big complicated thing, when really we have to break it down into separate things and see what works for you. Because a lot of veterans, they'll only try the VA therapy, they'll only try the sit on the couch and talk therapy, which kind of resembles a lot of times venting more than actual therapy, and complaining never really helps anyone. So one of the things I write about a lot is encouraging veterans to explore different kinds of therapy, to just give new things a shot.
Yeah, absolutely. Got a question coming from Richard. He says, what are your thoughts on the Camp Lejeune water scandal? I have a case lodged in the US.
I'll tell you what, that is one of those huge things where these people were just exposed to this. I mean, contaminated water and other chemicals. I mean, it's one of those things that you had all those people. I think for like 20 years, the people that were there were. You might have to correct me, Richard. It was like 20 years of contaminated water, and there's a lot of stuff on the internet about it. There's a lot of people talking about it. It's kind of like there's another lawsuit going on for veterans in the States who are given these faulty earplugs, that we use these earplugs in Afghanistan that I was issued to, and they knew that they didn't work, and they were still giving them out to us. So it's one of those cases that's complicated, and one of those things that you'll see the results of years later, with higher, like the Vietnam Agent Orange. You see higher levels of cancer, and you also see issues with their children, things like that. One of the things that's really interesting when I was in Vietnam is the huge effect it also had on the Vietnamese people with Agent Orange, where they had 3 or 4 generations of like birth defects and things like that, and you saw that with service members coming back who couldn't get their wives pregnant or things like that, who had these genetic defects in their children and stuff. So I think that the Camp Lejeune water scandal is something the government will continue to put on the back burner.
Yeah. I mean,
That's kind of what I think.
yeah, myself as an infantry soldier, we do a lot when we're training to protect the hearing and stuff like that. When we're on the ranges, we had the proper amplivox and stuff like that. Problem comes when you're out on an operational tour. The earplugs that they give you, you can't really wear them, because when you are in contact,
Yeah.
you can't hear what's going on with your mates, and the last thing you want to do is not hear an order to move, and you're still stuck there, and they've all buggered off and left you behind. And
Or the
it's not
last thing you
until you
want to do is
start,
when you get shot at is reach for your earplugs to put them in.
yeah. I know they've been trying to find ones that work, that you could hear normal sounds, but and then when loud noises like gunfire goes off, then it blocks that out. But I still don't think they're there properly. And then of course, being infantry, you've got your we call them, well, you call them walkie talkies, but we've got a similar sort of thing that we wear that communicates with the section or the platoon. And it's difficult to hear through when you've got earplugs in to hear through that. So yeah,
Absolutely.
you're on a hide into nowhere really, and it's just I got into a dust up in 2006, I think it was, and we almost ran out of ammunition. And then again in 2009, I was on a 50 cal, and my ears was ringing for a couple of days afterwards. But I did dissuade the
Yeah, I
Taliban from doing what they were doing.
think well, 50 cal is a very, very good persuasive weapon. It will dissuade them from doing about anything. So
It
yeah,
did
but
stop.
back to Richard, I'd say they have to follow the same kind of path that the U.S. recently passed that 9/11, the burn pit registry, and getting some money for that. Like I was around burn pits, in early Afghanistan, we're burning our own trash, which I think continued basically throughout the entire war. And it sounds kind of silly now because it's like, yeah, I was lighting trash on fire like quite a bit. So I think that Richard, maybe they should follow the path of the that the burn pit people follow, like and things like that, and really had a strong push for it in Congress. And I think until that kind of strong effort is there, I think it'll continue to get put on the back burner, especially when it's difficult to connect specific. It's like, hey, the people here have a much higher instances of cancer than the people who weren't here. But I think that's a complicated situation, and one, unfortunately, that the government's not going to stand up and take responsibility for that quickly.
Yeah. And so Richard's come back with that. I hope the VA really push the US government to resolve the issue. In my case, I've had 3 different Cat A cancers that are related to Camp Lejeune. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Richard. That's a tough
yeah.
call.
He's got a lawyer in the UK and stateless, stay in his case. So hope it all comes out to the good, Richard. In fact, I'm seeing Richard next week. We're going off to Holland together. We're going on a battlefield study tour. So, looking at veteran suicide, it's quite high in the UK. Lots and lots of veterans are taking their lives, unfortunately. And there is a case for trying to encourage guys to sort of come forward and talk. I think that's the biggest thing we can encourage them to do. If a veteran's out there that's thinking that they're all alone, they're in a dark place, they don't know where to turn, there are loads and loads of veterans groups that will happily listen. In fact, I've been to a veterans group this afternoon. It's called VOS, it's Veterans Outreach Support, and it's just a tea and stickies afternoon, sit around drinking tea and eating biscuits and taking a mickey out of each other, really. But they're there. If you've got a problem, they've got experts that will point you in the right direction and assist. So
Yeah,
there
and I
are,
think when the
yeah,
we
there
look
are
at we
lots
look
of
at therapy,
people.
and and a lot of times we look at therapy and it's not really as helpful as we want it to be regarding things like veteran suicide. I think we expect to go in there and sit down and talk about our problems and expect our problems to kind of go away. And a lot of the veteran problems are not necessarily wrapped up into things like PTSD. They're more wrapped up into like life. So that's why I think like life coaching and mentoring and things like that are sometimes a better path for veterans than traditional therapy. But they throw us
Yeah,
into traditional therapy and expecting our problems to go away but that's not really how life works. You know, a lot of times you have to be more, say, confrontational with your problems. You have to kind of attack your problems like you would a problem in the military. So you have to um, view your therapy as kind of a military mission, and that requires gathering resources. So you have to gather all the
Yeah.
resources you can, you know, and unfortunately, I think a lot of it comes back to transition, because if you have a good transition, then you're more likely to lead a successful life. Whereas if some things start going wrong, then they're going to continue to go wrong. So that's why I think college for young American veterans is a good starting point. I'm sure in the UK too, because it provides a
Mm.
little bit of structure and opportunities for growth and groups and things like that. Because, like you mentioned, it's easy for veterans to push themselves into isolation, and isolation is far more dangerous to veterans than combat is. I mean, more of us, have taken our lives
Yeah.
than we're lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think the first thing veteran needs to do is think about, one, their community, which in my book I talk about building your community as building your armor, because your community is your armor that kind of surrounds you
Mm.
and protects you. But you have to upkeep your armor. You have to shine it and polish it, in order to keep. And the second thing is to find purpose. So you need both those things, community and purpose. And a lot of times it's difficult to find a new life mission after the military, and that takes some exploration on a personal level. That's not really that can be difficult for veterans to do.
Mm. Yeah, it's also important that I mean, veterans sometimes find it difficult to transition out,
Hmm.
especially if they've only done a short time. Guys that have done sort of over 4 years or 5 years and beyond, there's a package put together
Hmm.
to transition, and you get paid to go and do different courses. There's some new life skills that you're taught to go outside. But I think lots of veterans, once they get outside, the comfort blankets pulled from under them, um, they start getting into. They find it difficult. I certainly, when I first left the first time, I found it really, really difficult going into a civilian environment and working with civilians that just don't have the same work ethic that a military person has. They haven't got the same mindset. It's job and finish, or if it doesn't get done, then it can wait. Then they don't like to finish anything. so
Hmm.
so and that's frustrating, uh, particularly for me anyway. Having and done all that time and expecting things to be done, and you ask somebody to do something, and they do it. You can trust them, but then you get a civilian that you ask them to do something, and then they don't bother, and then something goes wrong, and the whole thing goes petong. So frustrating, and I was fortunate in the fact that I found a way back into the military, and I ended up doing another 20 odd years, which for me was
Yeah.
brilliant because I didn't have to deal with them.
Yeah, the word no, unfortunately, is not really in the military vocabulary.
Mm.
You can't tell your leader no. It just doesn't
Yeah.
exist. I remember my first college class when I walked in. Like, I was fresh out of the military going to school, and of course I got to my class about 20 minutes early. I sat there, I had my pens and my
Yeah.
papers kind of all laid out, ready to go. And then time kept ticking, and time kept ticking. Eventually, it's 5 minutes before the class starts, and I'm the only person in the room. And I kind of start panicking, like, oh God, I must be in the wrong room. I mean, something's going on. And then, of course, like right before the bell rang, or right before the class starts, people come in with, like, half the class came in late on the very first day, carrying coffee cups. And, being late is just such an unforgivable sin in the military. And it's just, that's your first day. I mean, you learn, hey, right place, right time, right uniform. Do not be late.
Yeah.
And if you're not early, then you're late, because we start when we start. And if you're not ready
Yeah.
to go by that point, so that was kind of a culture shift, because I viewed other people being late as supremely disrespectful. I thought that
Yeah.
that was like the worst thing that you can do, and kind
Yeah.
of having those small shifts. You can't really hold civilians to military standards. It's just not something that can be done, and that's something that veterans really struggle with, is getting out and integrating into a new workplace when the military mentality is so ingrained into you. And that's why sometimes the first thing veterans need to do is just kind of relax a little bit. You have to, you can't carry that stress with you. You gotta relax.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to do after years of living a certain way.
Yeah, and I think that then it then causes more problems because guys that struggle with that sort of transition, then it all starts going petong at home because they're not used to being home every night. They used to being away half of the time,
Hmm.
and then it puts a strain on the marriage, and then the marriage starts to break down. Guy ends up on on the street, and then eventually turns to crime, and then ends up in jail. So uh, that's the problem with the military. They our jails are full of ex-service personnel where they've had trouble. Um, they're also far more likely to be living on the streets because they can't cope. And it's down to us to be able to
Do you have a
find those
special court
guys.
system that veterans go through?
No, they go through the same court system, and they end up in jail the same as everybody else, which is it's crazy. I had a
Okay.
workforce in ME and only
Some of
recruited
the some
ex-military. Yeah, that's a great comment there. So
yeah, I think a lot of veterans, they want to work for veteran companies and things like that. And veterans in the States, at least, are actually more likely to start their own businesses than civilians are after
yeah,
years of working for someone else. It's good to work for yourself. So there are a lot of veterans that are
yeah,
and trying to work for themselves opposed to trying to go work at a place where they're going to have conflict. I wrote an article on my website, conflict tips for veterans in the workplace, because a lot of veterans get to their workplace and they just struggle to fit in, and they're
yeah,
more likely to, use dark humor. In the military, you can say things that are just not going to be
yeah,
said in the workplace nowadays, and
yeah.
make
I
jokes.
mean, civilians just don't get dark humour at all, and
No, and that's
and
something you can be in trouble.
and with the woke society we've got nowadays, lots and lots of them are taken to tribunals because they've upset
Hmm.
somebody, they've upset a snowflake, and it's just, you see it on the news a lot. Somebody's taken to court because they've said something that's hurt somebody's feelings.
Yeah, and I think there's like a misconception for a lot of veterans that when you get out of the military, there's going to be just great jobs waiting for you. And I
Yeah,
think then you get out and you're surprised that that's not really the case. I mean, meet guys that they expect qualifications, and that their training is going to lead them into something. And for some employers, they want to hire veterans, but I think that there are a lot of employers that just do not, because they view military people as maybe, like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. And a lot of that's
mm,
because the news, the way Hollywood tells those stories. And that's why, I encourage veterans, I'm sure you do too, through your podcast here, to tell their stories. Because if we don't
yeah,
tell our stories, then they're not going to get told. I mean, we kind of live our stories in faraway lands with, surrounded kind of by temporary people. And telling your story is also kind of a form of therapy. When I started talking, like you mentioned, in peer groups about my combat experiences and the things I struggled with, that's when I actually was able to kind of find growth. I think a lot of veterans are kind of like, oh, I don't want to talk about it type people, and that's okay. But sometimes you have to talk about it, even to your family and friends, because they might not understand maybe why you are the way you are, or like you mentioned, your triggers with smells or things like
mm,
that. I know a lot of veterans that are triggered by things like fireworks. Like a firework goes off, you might be on edge the rest of the day. So I think that we veterans have to do just a better job themselves of being willing to tell their stories. And
yeah,
that's how you connect with society. I'm sure the UK is the same, where you kind of have this military civilian gap between the military and civilian populations. And with less and less people serving, that's only going to continue to grow. Uh,
mm,
So, Richard, my website's johnhdaviswriter.com. That's where I have my articles. I write a lot about different forms of therapy for veterans to explore, and as well as like my coaching program for student veterans and my books.
I'll that in the show notes afterwards, so you go back and pull it off if you like. Yeah, I was having a conversation with a mate the other day, and I was just saying, I don't think I've got any civilian friends at all. All my friends are ex-serving people, and the only civilians I actually know uh, is is my family.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, I
I don't
know.
know how to feel about that, but that's how it is, right?
Well, I'm fairly lucky where I live. I mean, is I live in a place called Gosport, which is in the south of England, and there was a survey came out in October, yeah, early November, from the census. We had a national census, and one of the questions was, "Are you an ex-service personnel, and where do you live?" And it turns out that where I live is the largest concentration of veterans in the country,
Mhm.
which is great because I'm involved with several veterans groups around here. So the yacht clubs, all a veterans yacht club. Um, I go to a couple of different yacht clubs, the veterans groups. I'm a member
Mhm.
of the HMS Victory Senior Rates Mess. So HMS Victory is the oldest commissioned warship in the world. I know the Americans try and say, well, we've got Constitution, yeah, but ours is a commissioned warship. Although it's not floating, it's the oldest commissioned warship in the world. So I've got the privilege of going on there, and that's all ex-serving types on there. So
Yeah,
my
I think that veterans
community
really,
is a veteran community, which is great.
and you're super fortunate to have that, to be surrounded by people who understand your experiences and kind of where you're coming from. I think
Yeah,
veterans, one thing we do have to do is kind of break free of that military bubble. A lot of us kind of isolate ourselves. I mean, like veterans in the States, you go to veteran bars, you wear veteran clothing, you talk to other veterans, but unfortunately, you're not in the military anymore. So you can't,
yeah,
you can't really take your military mindset into society. And in previous societies, war and peace were so kind of interconnected that the switch back and forth happened quite a bit. And you see a different reality in countries with mandatory military service, like Israel or South Korea, where people are able to transition back into society with greater
mm,
ease because the people around them have kind of been there, done that. And I think here in America, we're seeing ourselves be more and more disconnected from the civilian population, kind of like a psychological divorce or something, where we have to learn how to better bridge the divide. I mean,
mm,
during now it's less than 1% of the population serving. Like you're talking World War II, like 10% of people in the military, or 10% of the
yeah,
population served in World War II, and today it's less
yeah,
than 1%. I think that we isolate ourselves too. I mean, like you mentioned, we're isolated, at least in America, around military bases where we have our own shopping malls, our own movie theaters,
yeah,
our own schools, and everything. Outside the military base in America, it's going to be like tattoo parlors, car dealerships, strip clubs, payday loan places. We have our own kind of ecosystem, I think,
yeah,
and that it changes the way people look at us. I remember, I felt like I was looked at in a hero, like as a hero when I was in uniform, and then as soon as I took it off, people kind of viewed me as like broken or some kind of like they almost felt sorry for me when I said, "Oh, I just got back
yeah,
from Afghanistan." It's like they expected, I don't know, me to. I don't know what they expected. I think that they
mm,
all civilians all kind of think that we have PTSD or maybe broken sometimes, but that doesn't have to become a reality.
no, it definitely doesn't. So Richard lives up in the Midlands, and around his area, there's a lot of veterans as well, particularly from the regiment. It's one of our big recruiting areas, so uh, he's lucky up there. They've got a great rugby team as well.
Oh, that's good too. Yeah, I think, and telling our stories are one way to close that gap, to kind of break out of that bubble, because our stories are a part of history. I mean, and there's lots of organizations in America that actually help tell veteran stories. You can go online and record them, and then you can even show them to your family. They do books and things like that, or you can go on a podcast and tell your stories. To kind of document service members' experiences. The VA has a program for it's like a veteran history project, and I think that does a lot of good, because it gives you the opportunity to talk kind of candidly about your experiences in ways that you might not in an informal setting. And I think that kind of takes us deeper than the classic thank you for your service that we always hear in America, which is great to hear, but it's also one way of avoiding the necessary deeper conversation that has to take place for a nation to get to know its service members. So I usually tell people, hey, when someone says, thank you for your service, tell them a story. Tell them a story about your friends, or tell them a story about the military, or things you learned, or the experiences you had, or the places you went. Because I think that those stories can really be meaningful, and we can't just let Hollywood tell the stories, because they portray veterans as alcoholics, or like Lieutenant Dan and Forrest Gump, hey, no legs, alcoholic type people, those kind of. So if we tell our stories, I think that's one way to kind of humanize us a little bit, because we're viewed as kind of a different kind of people, and I think that gap kind of leads to a lot of societal problems that we discussed about. Because the veteran population will always mirror the civilian population. As civilian population becomes more depressed, becomes fatter, deals with all these issues, the military is going to deal with them as well.
It's funny you're saying about the VA sort of giving the opportunity to veterans to tell the story. A few years ago, I was invited to the Imperial War Museum to tell my story of operations in Afghanistan from my perspective of being a PSYOPs operator. And there's about three and a half hours of my memoirs in the Imperial War Museum that they're going to use at some stage, probably years to come, which is great. And plus I've told my story on the podcast, and I quite regularly sort of go on other people's shows and tell some of the stories.
Yeah, I think that's it's one way, and I think that veterans should play a bigger role in education as well, because in the States, I'm not sure how things are over there, but in the States, military matters aren't really taught much in K through 12 education. The people growing up, I mean, I recruited for the Army in New York for 2 years, and whenever I got to classroom, I put up a map of the Middle East. I say, here's the Middle East. Does anyone know where Iraq or Afghanistan is? And we've been fighting, wars there for 20 years, for all their lives at this point. This was 2017 or 18. I mean, every day these kids' lives, we've been at war there, and the kids can't even they don't know where the countries are on the map. I think that, that kind of, it leads, I mean, I think that, I think it just leads to people not wanting to join the military too, if they don't know anything about it. And I think that the military could teach people, kids should take tours of bases. You can learn about first aid, technology, physical fitness, and all the things that make the military good, as well as learn about things like discipline. So I think that veterans need to do a better job, or the country needs to do a better job of teaching people about everything from military history to military lessons and values.
I think that's a good point, actually, because while we're not fighting anywhere, we're forgotten about. It's not until, I don't know what it's like in America, I mean, you have the National Guard that gets called out for disasters and stuff like that. Well, we don't have a National Guard as such, but if there's a natural disaster or there's a crisis, the first people that they call on is the military to come and sort it out. We saw it in 2012 with the London Olympics. Right until sort of the 11th hour, a civilian company was going to run the security side of it and all the rest of it. They pulled out at the 11th hour, and the military had to step up to it. Then we've had the vaccine rollout in the country. The military were called in to sort it all out, to get it delivered. Whenever there's a crisis, we had some flooding going on in just outside a place called Caterham, near Croydon, in South London, a few years ago, and they called out the guards from Wellington Barracks to go down and just fill sandbags to block off this flood. So the military's called out to do all sorts of stuff, and all they've done over the last few years is cut the military budget, cut the military, the numbers. If truth be told, we don't actually have an army anymore. We have a militia. We haven't got enough numbers to be able to call it an army, which is sad. And like you were saying at the top of the show, we are struggling with recruiting at the moment for all three of our services. We've got 2 brand new aircraft carriers. We've got some new Type 26s coming on. We've got some Type 45 destroyers. They struggle at crewing them, and it's because they haven't invested in the military enough.
And it's it's about investing in veterans.
Yeah, they've given all our ammunition away to Ukraine, which is fine. But now we haven't got enough ammunition for ourselves, so and they're struggling at replacing it, and they're not investing in replacement. You couldn't make it up. It's crazy.
Yeah, and they don't. You have to invest in veterans post service as well. The military
Absolutely.
spends hundreds of thousands of dollars and years training you to be a soldier or be a sailor or in your job
Yeah.
or whatever. And then when it's time to get out, you kind of just get. I went through a week-long class, 10-day class in which I sat in the classroom, and they tell you how to make a resume, and then they kind of kick you out into the world. But my entrance in the military was, a lot more of a complicated process. So I think that one way of, the military doing a better job of recruiting is you have to demonstrate the veterans can thrive post-service. You have to show people that it's going to be something to benefit your life. And as I think, we go through a societal shift or maybe a world shift where people are valuing in the individual more than the community, and that leads to less people having the military type values. I mean, the military is, a communal environment. It's about teamwork. It's about shared purpose. And society has shifted into a more and more individualistic, kind of stance to where, even hyper individualized with technology and all that stuff is people aren't really thinking like, instead of, JFK, like what's the famous quote? I'm kind of missing it in my head right now, but ask not what.
Oh, ich bin I'm Berliner.
Yeah.
When he went to Berlin.
So I think that we have to highlight how the military is something to be looked at in a positive light. It's something that can be looked at like a transformative thing, and that's how you look at. You have to show and demonstrate veterans thriving post service and doing well. And when the news only shows veteran suicide numbers or like Afghanistan, which I think, in my opinion, did a lot to harm military recruiting, because a lot of veterans like myself look at Afghanistan, kind of how that ended, and it makes it harder to close that chapter in our lives, because we're not really sure our place in history, and you're kind of left wondering what it was all for. I mean, I spent my entire 20s in the military and almost 3 years in Afghanistan, 3 years that time in Afghanistan, and I'm certainly grateful for the opportunity to go over there and and serve and try to improve things. But I'm still kind of left wondering, maybe,
what it was all
about,
for. Yeah.
About my legacy.
I think the way that we came out was wrong, absolutely wrong. But what Biden did is, he should be on trial for it. The trouble that he caused, and what he's left behind, and we didn't need to. It didn't need to happen like that. There was only around about 2,500 Americans there anyway, with air ops supporting the Afghans. They could have stayed there. They weren't troops on the ground.
Yeah.
But they were supporting the Afghan army, and you can't blame the Afghan army. Yeah,
No,
I'm
I
really,
mean that was
I'm really, really bitter about the way that it finished. I'm really sorry,
yeah, and I think
and
a lot of veterans
I just
are.
feel for the Afghans because they are nice people. They
Mhm.
are great
And
people.
now you're seeing the huge step backwards in in society there. I mean, I remember watching the people fall from airplanes, and it just looked like
Yeah,
a horror movie or something. I mean, and like you mentioned, my years there were kind of the best and the worst of my life, and I think that the challenges I faced there kind of eventually brought out the best of me. And I don't think it was ever possible for us to come home to like victory parades like World War II veterans did. You're
mm,
fighting kind of a very complicated conflict. And I think that also it feels a lot like Vietnam, where both endings kind of had tragic,
yeah,
chaotic, and were confusing. I mean, we gave a lot of our blood and sweat and tears to something that was kind of embarrassingly abandoned. And
yeah,
it's kind of like it's so I don't know what ending the war should have had in Afghanistan, but I know that veterans who have all served there deserve a better one.
absolutely.
Because we went off to fight, and I mean it's not like Al Qaeda's not there anymore, and the humanitarian crisis is going to
Yeah,
likely kill more people than the war will in the coming
yeah,
years because there's going to be mass starvation, women forced to terrible things, and I think that also leads to the identity crisis in my generation of veterans, where contributes to things like suicide and things a
yeah.
lot like and looking back over a year later, it's difficult. It's difficult to wrap your mind around.
Mm. Well, John, we've gone over time. Amazing. This hour's just flown by. I'd just like to thank you so much for coming on and having this discussion with me tonight. It's been terrific.
Yeah,
So,
I really appreciate having you on to talk about these
yeah,
things. And like I mentioned before, my book is hold it up for YouTube,
yeah,
Combat to College, and it's a guide for veterans to get through their education as successfully as possible and set themselves up post service.
yeah. And I'll put the links up on the description. So thanks very much, John. I'll see you in a minute. Wow. Hopefully you enjoyed that. I think that was a really good discussion we've had this evening. John brought out some really, really salient points about what us veterans go through. So until next week I've got the quiz is going to go out as a premiere, and next week's Everyday Conversations is going to go out as a premiere. They're pre-recorded because I'm going to be away next week, so I'm going to be there hopefully in the chat while the while it's going out. So I recorded it a few weeks ago, and it should be a really, really good one. So until next week, thank you again. I've got another great episode going out on ordinary people's extraordinary stories on Sunday morning, so be sure to hang out for that one. And just like to thank you all for being there. So until next week, TTFN. Ta-ta for now.